Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, guys, gals, everybody. It is September the 10th, and Ivan and I just finished recording another podcast, and we're launching this one today. And things are going well. We just had our highest numbers ever downloads, so obviously the word is getting out, and our social media numbers are kind of growing exponentially. And when you look at the graphs, we're kind of amazed that there are still more people than ever kind of finding us and enjoying the work. So, hey, we always love questions, and we always love criticism and comments. So please feel free to send us emails or put that information out there when you see a post you like or don't like. We're not perfect. We're trying to learn. We're trying to get better. Every day in the clinic we see things that stump us, and those are the things that keep us going. And so we try to bring that stuff to you guys. We hope you appreciate it. I think you do. On that note, when you get a chance, if you're ever on one of these social media things like iTunes or what have you, and you can put out a rating or some nice words or what have you on the reviews, please do that. It helps. It does help. Exposure helps. It costs us a fair amount of money to keep this thing going, and a lot of that is based off of time, but we've got blogs and websites and things like SoundCloud and Libsyn and people that do some graphical stuff for us. It does cost some money, and it's nice that we don't have to dip too far into our pockets. So when you do a nice review, it helps us because sponsors take note of that and want to sponsor the podcasts and shows. So anything you can do to help us will help us keep this as free as possible. I feel like we're on a journey here to help as many people as we can, and we've really enjoyed it. It's been over 6 years now, and we just wanted to thank you guys. So we're going to do a real short sponsor today. It's Ultra Shoes. As you guys know, I love my Ultras, but Ivan and I talk a little bit more on podcast 113 at the end about the new Ultra Lone Peak 3.0s. And it's a new shoe that's out. It's a proprietary material that they're using to waterproof these things, but they're a little bit above the ankle hiking boot. They've got tremendous treads on them. I'm hoping that the Ultra Boys will send me a pair. Ivo sells them in his office, so if you're up there in the mountains of Colorado, you can find some of these shoes over there at Ivo's place. You guys know that I wear the Ultra every day in the office, and I love them. And I wanted to thank Golden and his team over there for making sure that I'm always ready to go in my clinic with a new pair every few months, and I love them. And I try to make sure that we always take on sponsors with products that we believe in, and we believe in the Ultra Running company. That's ultrarunning.com. They've got a new thing over there called the Desert Boot, I think, that just came out, and it's a kind of a casual shoe, 0 drop, leather. I'm waiting and hoping for a pair of those, but if they don't come, I'm gonna buy them. So we'd suggest you guys too. So great company. We love these guys, and we hope they're around for a long time. Check them out. Make sure you tell them that the Gait guys sent you. Maybe they'll do a little something for you. On with the show. We've got something neat today. At least I think it's neat. Having been in the podcast world for about 5 years now, when I understand and appreciate how much work it is to put one of these things together, and how much work it is to keep it going. For those listeners out there, we are, last time I checked, we are over 80 to 90 countries around the world, and that says something. That means people are kind of taking note of what we're doing here. People don't generally download things that they don't intend to listen to. So that's amazing. Neither Ivo and I ever expected such a reach for our work. And we're certainly glad that we can reach out to as many people as we can in as many countries as we are. And it's kind of amazing that with the advent of the internet and social media, that it's allowed people like us, just two little clinicians in two small towns in USA, to reach as many people as we can. But we hope you guys appreciate, we think you do, all the hard work that we do to dig. A lot of it is just for ourselves because we're two curious fellows, and we hope that our hard work helps you guys out. So This next little thing on that tangent is called The Messengers, and it's a podcast documentary team. It's kind of interesting. It's only 2 or 3 minutes of your time. I think you'll take interest to it. We're looking forward to the movie coming out. I think it may help expand podcasting a little bit more. Imagine this, radio shows without a lot of commercials. It's the stuff that you can dial in and hear what you want to hear. You can turn it off when you don't want to, and you can return to it. It's really changing radio, and podcasts are growing fast. We're glad to have you guys aboard here. Have a listen to this. We'll see you on the other side of the band for the podcast. We got a great show lined up for you. We hope you take some time. Go for a walk or run, put us in your ears, and enjoy. See you on the other side, guys.
I don't listen to radio. I haven't listened to radio in years. And the one day I forgot my phone, it was like nails on a chalkboard. It's great podcasting. It's like porn. You know it when you see it.
Oh my God, people have no idea how much work this really is.
Don't be afraid to start. Just get started.
People are going to always want to have a voice. They're going to want to always share it with people.
It's the experience of the excitement of connecting with somebody.
Capturing the power of intimacy is something that podcasting does better than any other medium.
It's got to be something you're passionate about, because when you first start out, you're going to be podcasting to nobody.
Let the listeners be part of your journey, because they're the ones that are going to be spreading the word about your show.
Podcasting has never gone down. It has gone up every single year.
So many people that were so encouraging and saying that we need something like this right now.
I don't eat or drink or sleep anymore. I just podcast.
We're having fun doing it. Best job I've ever had. I think we're just at the beginning.
And on that topic, the piece you just heard is called The Messengers. It's a podcast documentary, and they are now funding over on Indiegogo.com. Looks like they've got about $13,000 raised by a little over 100 backers. They're about 63% funded. They've got several levels of featured contributions from $5 all the way up to $200. These guys are trying to put it out there, the message, hence the name The Messengers. If you guys got a little extra cash in your pocket and you want to put it towards something that seems valuable, head over there. If not, at least look at it or put it up on your social media site so other people can see the project. Every little bit helps. So there you have it, folks. Pretty interesting, I thought. It's nice to see that. And folks who don't podcast, who are just consumers and not producers, probably don't understand how much time goes into it. I think we probably put less time in than most folks. And for those of you who are interested, I take about a half an hour, maybe, 45 minutes in a week to put up or find an itinerary. It usually develops slowly over a period of a week or two. I've got a folder and I put interesting articles in there, and then I try to collate some things that have a similar topic, because usually there's some kind of a theme, although sometimes when I do go off on tangents. We try to pull up a neuroscience piece. We try to make it interesting, and we send it off. I send it off to Ivo. He looks at it, and then we basically call up one Friday afternoon and we start recording. And then we just, as you guys know, we just put it out there. But there's probably another 45 minutes to an hour of editing at the end. So all in all, it might be an hour of pre-production, an hour to record, and an hour of post-production. So each podcast is about 3 hours of time. It's not a lot, but it's time. It's time that he and I don't have, but we make time for it because we want to get what we think is important information out there. And frankly, I truly enjoy talking with Ivo. I learn a lot from him, as I think you guys do as well. And I learn a lot from from the pre-production into looking at the articles and thinking about things. And it's one thing to read something, but it's another thing to have to read about it and then talk about it intelligibly, and to have to know some background behind it. So it's a learning curve for us, and Ivan and I are very curious guys. It's a journey of curiosity for us. So we're glad you guys are here. We're glad that we've got tens of thousands of folks around the world now in many different countries, many of which we didn't even know could digest English, but they're obviously finding a way, and maybe there's a translation. I don't know, but we're very grateful for this audience that is you, and we thank you guys for listening to our stuff. We thank you for sharing it. We thank you for your comments. We just thank you. And if you like what we're putting out there, please share it with a friend. Link it on your Facebook page. Tell some people about it. We're sharing, and we would hope that you guys would too. And that's what it's all about. It's about sharing. We were taught it in school when we were little kids. Share. And that's what we hope you guys will do. Back for another show here, number 111, and we've got a good show lined up. Ivan and I are going to kind of wing this one. We've got a couple topics that we want to talk about, things that we have had on social media and some articles we've come across, and some things that are burning holes in our minds. And this first one was, it was actually from a Facebook post that I had put up on, gosh, I didn't even write it down. I don't know what it was on, but a follower, a former student of mine who is, he's been out in the field now for, 15 years or so, Dr. Bill, and he sent an email over and asked us what we thought about this one in the pain and science community. He says, so what do you guys have to say about the pain and science community who continue to tout research that shows that position, posture, and supposed abnormal anatomy such as genu-valgum or leg length discrepancies have nothing to do with pain or injury. He then included an article out of tndonline.com, and it was entitled "Lower Limb Alignment Characteristics Are Not Associated with Running Injuries in Runners." So I went and pulled up that article, and I think to be a little bit more accurate, and it was out of the European Journal of Sports Science. The summary of their article said that we did not find any significant associations between lower leg length discrepancy, Q angle, which is the femur pelvis angulation, and subtalar angle and plantar arch index in injury occurrence. So I get what Bill was talking about. These guys tended to find, and they took a bunch of runners. Let me see, how many did they take? A total of 89 recreational runners. And they put them through a series of a period of running over 12 weeks. And that was basically their conclusion at the end of it, was that they did not find a significant association between lower length discrepancy, Q angle, subtalar angle, and plantar arch index and injury occurrence. So basically what I think they're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that any angulations, any leg length discrepancies, any basically lower extremity, and I don't want to clump everything into there, but they're clumping four big things in here. They don't seem to think that any changes in biomechanical issues side to side or overall have any incidence or correlation to injuries. And obviously I had a big beef with that, and I thought that the N number in that study, 89, wasn't enough, and perhaps that study was a little bit more myopic than it should have been. But it sent me on an article of discovery and a rant on things that we usually like to rant on, that looking at 3D capture or motion capture and gait analysis, has a problem, and looking at just a few factors or variables in a small population has a problem. But it brought me to an article from Shi et al. On chronic ACL deficiencies, and it is a very complicated summary of this article, and I'm not going to go into it, but really what it went through, if you trace it back to the things we've talked about on antiphasic gait and pairing arm and leg swing, and what happens when patients have spine pain, that arm rotation and the deviations between shoulder girdle and pelvic girdle tend to become reduced to try to maximize spine stiffness to reduce the pain response. And they looked at all kinds of things: lateral trunk flexion, posterior trunk lean, trunk rotation, shoulder posturing, etc. Basically found exactly what we had found, and what a lot of McGill's work has suggested, that if you want to have symmetrical fluid gait, you're going to have a stable enough spine. And in their case, in their article, they were looking at a chronic right ACL deficiency. So every time that client stepped down on that right leg, the deficient ACL knee, meaning there's some sloppiness and some movement and some instability, whether it's functional and or anatomical, was playing out at the central nervous system level, creating a protective response, which might have been a reduction in lateral trunk flexion or rotation or lean, etc. We'll have the you can find that post on our Facebook page. We will have it in the show notes here so that you can dive into it a little deeper, because to be honest, it's a little hard to juggle this through just verbiage without having a person in front of you, a video in front of you, or more importantly, something that I do a lot is reading something and standing up and trying to mimic the postures that the study or description is explaining. And when I do that, I can actually feel what they're talking about. So we will let you do that. But it brought up that whole, I really don't know if I believe everything I read in that study. It certainly brought some thoughts forward, but I knew on a neurologic level that's where a lot of these compensations are coming from, and I thought you might have a comment on all this.
It was interesting. I wasn't able to read the full text. I just read through the abstract. But and it was interesting that they picked just people with ACL deficient knees as opposed to MCL or PCL or a different ligamentous problem. But what you're seeing here is CNS modification of movement to attempt to put that knee in a position of maximal stability. So remember that the knee, compared to, say, the foot, the hand, the face, etc., has less cortical representation. Therefore, proprioceptive cues from that particular joint are not going to be as good as they are from other areas. So you're going to borrow from other areas to try to make up for that. And that's what they showed here. On the people that had the ACL issues, they had more problems when descending stairs. Okay, they would have a tendency to lean back because they wanted to move their center of gravity instead of directly over that, slightly behind that. When they were going upstairs, they went to the opposite side to not load that joint as much. So all these movements are somewhat protective, and we need to keep all of that in the back of our mind when we're examining patients, looking at their individual cases, the things that they're seeing, etc. Because a lot of what you might be seeing is their CNS adaptation to what's going on for their, pathology or their problem. So in this particular study, okay, so we're looking at people that don't have ACLs, and this is a typical pattern in people that either have ACL deficiency, and they didn't, or I don't really know what they were calling deficient. Does that mean they're +2, +3 laxity, complete tear, etc.? But what it does do is it provides insight, and you want to take all this into consideration when you're going through your rehabilitation process. And in this particular one, we saw differences in ambulation as well as ascending and descending stairs. So spend more time working with individuals on those specific tasks, because that's where they're going to be, and provide cues, clues, or support for them in those positions so that they can overcome some of those proprioceptive abnormalities. I had a gal that was in my office today who was ACL deficient. She had come in actually to see me for something totally different with her ribs, but she was a runner. But she said that she hadn't skied or snowboarded since she had done her ACL several years ago. And I'm like, gosh, that's really unusual. If you could run, why would you not ski, snowboard, etc.? She goes, well, I can run as long as I'm on a flat surface. If there's any undulation in the surface, pebbles, etc., and I go out, basically what she meant was outside the sagittal plane, her knee will buckle and she'll have all kinds of problems. So she's trained her nervous system to kind of keep her good in that one particular plane. Whereas if she tends to go out of that plane, she has problems. So rehab could certainly be directed in those areas. Now, having an ACL is kind of important, but we have lots of patients, as I'm sure you do, that are ACL deficient that lead totally normal lives and are active and doing all sorts of other things. So we're not saying you don't need it. What we're saying is that you can train around that.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of things now that I hear you talking. It kind of gets my brain in a groove here that the difference between an acute ACL and a chronic right ACL deficient knee is that pivot shift and rotational instability increases during the chronicity phase, meaning over time you tend to compromise the posterolateral restraints, typically the posterolateral corner of the knee, the ligaments of Riesberg and Humphreys, and that posterolateral corner, which tend to offset a pivot shift or rotational issue. This is why people who have an ACL deficient knee who do not have it amended, corrected, replaced, fixed, etc., tend to develop more disability as the years go on, as those restraints become attenuated. Pivot shifts occur. They get these immediate subjective moments of instability, particularly when stepping down off a curb or on a step where there's a little bit more shear than normal because the ACL is gone, but the secondary restraints are attenuated. So not only is there more shear, but now there's some rotation. The knee buckles inwards typically, and they have to go into a flexor withdrawal response in order to try and maintain some type of stability, or they buckle and fall over. We've talked and discussed it at length over the last several, maybe 2 months, about chronic ankle sprains and their effect at the supraspinal level. And it certainly brings up the things that are really near and dear to your heart, with keeping the eyes and the vestibular mechanisms or apparatuses on the horizon to maintain stability. And a lot of the things that we see in these chronic, whether it's ankles or in this case a chronic right ACL deficient knee, is we see a lot of adaptive changes in the trunk. Here they talk about rotation, posterior lean of the trunk, lateral deviation of the trunk, a change in shoulder rotation. And these things tend to help the brain to find stability. And sometimes often that stability is shifting over the more stable limb, but you also have to keep your eyes and your vestibular mechanism and hopefully the cervical spine proprioceptive inputs at a relative norm. But it reminds me of all of these chronic vertigo patients that have been coming in lately, and almost all of them have had a recent history of a significant injury to the ankle or knee in my office. And they've had a bit of a limp and obviously some antalgia. And so I don't think that there is any surprise there when I step back and look at it from a more global perspective. Would you tend to agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would also emphasize that when you're going through the rehabilitative process with these patients, as you said, whether they elect surgical repair or not, or prolotherapy or whatever their modality is, you really need to emphasize proprioceptive input, because we need not only those joint mechanoreceptors, and of course you've destroyed some of the ones that are in the ACL if you tear the ACL, but surrounding that joint, as well as the muscle mechanoreceptors in that area, need to be able to adapt and pick up some of the slack. And if that's not trained appropriately, you'll have a strong knee in one particular direction, but not in any other directions. One of the things we really push in our office is proprioceptive exercises, because they just have so much cortical, bang for their buck, such to say. So they inhibit pain. They're going to recruit other muscles in hopefully natural patterns that we like to see. And then by kind of grooving that pattern into the nervous system, like Stu McGill talks about a lot of times, you're going to help that patient to maintain way more stability. It could be something as simple as step-ups, balancing on one leg, eyes open, eyes closed, and then doing the same thing on, say, a rocker board, and then, say, a BAPS board, and then progressing on to a BOSU or something along those lines. But really spending the time to do that. We used to think, oh gosh, we have like hundreds of mechanoreceptors, around the joints, and we know from Rob McLean's work in the late 90s that that's just not true. There's just not that many receptors, and if you only have 12 to 20 receptors in a joint and you blow away a portion of those, now we have that much less percentage input going into the brain telling us where that particular joint is in space. So the surrounding musculature, etc., needs to pick up the slack to make up for that. Otherwise, you're going to expose yourself to re-injury, which is probably one of the major reasons that we see such a recurrence of a lot of injuries if proprio is not included in the rehabilitative process. And I'm sure you see this all the time. I'm in your office, and people, we'll give them simple balance stuff, and they're like, and that's it? I'm like, well, can you do the exercise? And they're like, no. It's like, all right, well, we'll talk about, adding additional stuff on after you can do the basics. It's like, let's walk before we run. And I'm sure you see that all the time. People are, big, enormous, or strong, or extremely athletic person that thinks that standing on one leg with their eyes closed and their head extended is just way too simple until they can't do it. And then it's like, you start to explain, okay, so you're running down this trail and it's rocky talus and you can't necessarily see where your foot is going, and the lighting is flat, and all of a sudden now you need to proprioceptively correct in a direction because your foot got thrown in one direction because the rock you thought was flat was actually slanted, either into varus or valgus, and your foot moves into that position. Now what are you going to do? And it's like we say in our office a lot of times with training, it's not about rehabilitating the injury as much as it is about retraining you. And it's not about injury prevention. It's about preparing for the fall or preparing for the injury. And by having all of these systems kind of online and working. And just like you said, you see people with ankle, knee, hip problems, etc., that develop problems upper extremity, vertigo, cervical spine, etc. Not uncommon at all. And you have this chronic low level of inflammatory input into the nervous system that, sort of creates this, aberrant movement pattern or whatever that's going on. But this paper really brought a lot of that stuff to light.
Yeah, the thoughts are coming here with what you're saying. That, you got to remember that when you are rehabbing someone, if you don't have all the original parts, and for example, you take an unstable knee, and you start to rehab it, you've got to understand that you may rehab them into a compensation pattern and not the clean, pristine pattern that you're hoping for. And I think you need to realize that if you're going to delve into this stuff, you have to know that the ACL is such a critical proprioceptive organ in that lower limb. And when you take that out, you have a huge deficit on the proprioceptive receptor side of things. And the brain is basically missing that input. It's kind of like on a very subtle level of having a knee joint replacement. You take out the parts, the brain wonders where the joint is in space and loading responses and directional movements and whatnot. So there's a price to be paid somewhere. And I've been seeing a fair number of partial ACL tears in the office recently, and obviously people aren't doing surgery on those, but you've got to, encourage the client that, you need that ligament healed up and snug. The last thing you want it to do is heal in a grade 1 or grade 2 attenuated state, and now you've set the stage for a chronic instability issue on a low level down the road, of which the brain's going to have to make up the difference. I'm reminded of a case of a young decathlete, high school decathlete fellow who was on his way to a scholarship at a Big Ten school, and he went over to, what a huge step, they went over to Belgium and had the knee ACL redone, much different than the way they were doing it here at the time, where they would do an autograft or an allograft from a patellar tendon or a cadaver or a hamstring tendon, etc. And they went over there and they basically stitched the ACL together and rebridged it across there, trying to create this vine-like effect across. And things kind of came full circle for me in the last 6-8 months, where my at Gracie Baja here in Downers Grove, Illinois, my professor, Carlos Limos Jr., a world champion jiu-jitsu practitioner, here tore his ACL, and he did his homework and found someone doing the similar process here down in California. They basically went in, stitched the two parts of the ACL together, and then did a series of, I think, 3 stem cell injections, basically injecting it into that new ACL, or the reconstructed ACL. And he is one of the fastest ACLs we have ever rehabbed in the office. He came around so quickly, and you got to think he didn't have any patellar tendon to deal with. There was minimal damage within the joint itself. There was no hamstring graft, and so he came out of the surgery with full ranges of motion, and all we needed to do was basically dial him back enough so that he could protect it long enough for the thing to heal. But once rehab started, I mean, my God, it was fast. He was doing stuff that was several weeks ahead of any of my other ACL reconstruction rehab cases. So this is going to become the norm, and using PRP and stem cells is going to become the new norm. You've probably read, if you've been keeping up with the literature here, folks, that just recently they took a study of patients with stroke, and some of them had been 22 or 24 months post-stroke with gait abnormalities, and they injected stem cells into the infarcted brain area where the stroke had been, and these clients showed dramatic improvements in some of the gait parameters necessary to regain a healthy gait. So we are moving very quickly into this stem cell generation of therapy. And I'm sure you're seeing it in your office. No longer is it a cortisone injection. It's maybe cortisone plus some PRP, which is a plasma-rich protein, which is spun down platelets and all of that. We've talked about that in prior podcasts. But things are moving forward very quickly here. And I think the bottom line where I'm going with this is that there's going to be no excuse for having a chronic right ACL deficient knee anymore. People will just be getting it fixed like I've just described, because it's quick and it's easy, and you don't have to deal with a lot of these issues that Ivan and I just talked about for the last 20 minutes long term. So but it's good to be aware of these things, because there's going to be clients that come in that are no longer candidates.
So just one other thing, since we're still on the subject, and not to beat a dead horse, but if you have an ACL deficient knee, try adding head motion, particularly lateral tilt, to either side. So if you have an ACL deficient knee and you have a tendency to buckle to the inside, if you tilt the head to the right, okay, what's going to happen is you're going to engage your semicircular canals in such a way that it's going to move your body to the left, basically opposite head tilt. And you can use head motion, cervical spine motion, in the rehabilitative process to get them better faster. Not that you want somebody running with the head tilt to one side, but the point is giving them these cues and clues and knowing about things like tonic neck responses and crossed extensor responses and stuff like that during the rehabilitative process, like you said, is just gonna push these people so much further, so much faster. And you combine that with a better diet, you combine that with perhaps some natural anti-inflammatory sort of things like curcumin, or liposomal turmeric, things like that, it's going to make a huge difference. And while we're on the subject, and changing subjects slightly, but when you're doing your ACL reconstruction and repair and rehabilitation, you may consider using a treadmill. And this week on the blog, you put up a great piece talking about some of the, I don't want to call them pitfalls, but we'll call them issues or concerns or things that you need to watch out for that happen with a non-motorized treadmill. Now, we've talked plenty of times about motorized treadmills, and if you go back to July 8th on our Facebook page, we had a post looking at motorized treadmill issues. But you did an awesome one on non-motorized treadmills, which seem to be the trend nowadays, particularly with that C-shaped deck. So you're kind of walking, it's sloped But why don't you talk about that a little bit? I found that pretty fascinating, and there was a couple things in it I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, well, on our social media page, and somewhere in June there, we put up I think it was early June, some videos of, I should say June 2016, because we are 100 podcasts into this over a couple of years, so you better get the year right, June 2016. And it's on the blog as well, so you can at least dial into the right month on our blog now if you go through the archives. But we put up a video comparing the, is it the Woodway treadmill? And there was the other one that the CrossFitters are using. It's eluding my mind right now. It's on the tip of my tongue. I'm sure it'll come up here in a minute. And they were comparing these non-motorized treadmills where you self-power yourself. They are C-curved, and but one of them had a momentum device in there that kept the treadmill running a little bit, and they felt that they had lost a little bit of control on it. But anyways, this study here was looking at the non-motorized treadmills, and they were looking at some of the gait parameters. And here was basically the facts. Non-motorized treadmill locomotion creates large reductions in tibial acceleration. Non-motorized treadmill locomotion increases lower limb muscular activation, and it decreases cycle time. In other words, increases your step frequency because you have to power it, self-power it. So, the dialogue that I was going on at that time was that we still have a large population of people out there that are, maybe rightly so, but sometimes misinformedly so, using gait analysis software and real-time digital software with sensors and whatnot to analyze people's gait. And if you've been with us long enough, you know our horse beating mantra that you're not seeing the problem quite frequently on gait analysis. You're seeing a patient strategizing around it, just like we talked about with the changes in our previous 20-minute dialogue on ACLs and all the trunk adaptations that people go into in order to maintain some degree of postural stability. And so, it would be nice to know, and maybe should be mentioned in future studies when people are doing this, what kind of treadmill they're on, motorized or non-motorized. Is there an incline? You'll talk about that in a little while, I think, here on whether the treadmill is inclined and how much incline. And so there's a lot of things here that non-motorized treadmills will help us with. And I went back and read the post that you happened to put up today, July 8th, 2016, which was a recap of an old rewind that we had done on treadmills and things to be aware of. And gosh, it was good to read that again and remind myself of a couple things of how powered treadmills can really be a problem if you're not aware of what you're doing in terms of creating slow stretches in the quadriceps and in the hamstrings and in the calf muscles. So you probably want to go down that path next, right?
Actually, what I wanted to talk about was in the study you were talking about, they were talking about markedly decreased tibial acceleration, which I found really fascinating, and I was like, why would the tibia not? And I'm assuming they're talking about internal spin and external spin. And I was trying to figure out, why, when you're doing a self-propelled treadmill, would tibial spin be reduced so much? Because we need that internal rotation to basically, create some degree of pronation, which is going to occur in the foot, and supination as well. So my theory is that self-powered or unmotorized treadmills, because they're not motorized, you're going to use your posterior compartment musculature much more, particularly your external rotators of your hips. So if, as I'm coming through my initial contact loading response, getting through mid-stance, terminal stance, pre-swing, or running, that those mechanics will change slightly. As you're coming through that, because you're forcing that backwards, you are engaging, and it'd be interesting really to see some EMG studies on this, but you're going to engage that posterior compartment, particularly the deep six external rotators, which we talk about, as you're going through during that first half of stance phase. And that's probably what's reducing that. And because we don't have as much internal spin, we won't have as much external spin. So it'll be really interesting, one, to stick some needles in those muscles, because we can't really monitor those with surface EMG, although we could certainly look at Gmax. Gmead would probably be a better choice, but we could see if Gmax is getting activated during that, as well as some sticky dots on tibial tuberosities and patellas and things like that as they're coming through that, to just see exactly how much is that reducing rotation compared to their, say, normal gait compared to regular treadmill gait. But that was one of the things that was a mind bender. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me see if I can just clarify for our listeners, and maybe you can clarify if my assumption is right, that the glutes and the external rotators are just that. They're powerful external rotators, and thus they are resisting internal rotation of the femur, which essentially resists internal rotation of the tibia. So if you've got more posterior compartment external hip rotators, glutes, that are forcing more external rotation, you're going to get less internal rotation at the tibia, or i.e. relatively more external rotation of the tibia. So you're kind of counteracting that natural pronatory effect or internal spin effect of the tibia, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. Sometimes I like to say things, you probably do it too, is everybody hears things differently, so sometimes I will say the same thing 3 or 4 different ways, hoping that I can catch the client's light bulb moment on things, and trying to do that for you listeners here. So
if you throw enough up against the wall, some of it will stick.
Gonna stick. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I had some other thoughts here on this, and they just disappeared into the ether on me here. But it also could be that because a normal motorized treadmill, we've talked about this, is going to, when you put your foot down, the treadmill or the ground is already moving posteriorly. So you put that foot down, and all of a sudden, the moment that heel or midfoot catches, that leg is being vaulted or accelerated posteriorly, which tends to slap the forefoot down. It tends to pull that tibia backwards. It tends to pull the hip into extension, and as you've said, pulls the knee into extension and creates that stretch response in the hip flexors and in the hamstrings. And on this powered treadmill, especially because these things are curved a little bit, we're probably getting a huge reduction in some of those issues, and that may be why there are large reductions in tibial acceleration as well. And perhaps that's just another way of saying what we just said, maybe through a side window or back door here. So I do think that these treadmills, although terribly expensive, are going to become the new thing. I would imagine that the maintenance on these things is much less, although I don't know, there's no motor in it, so I'm not seeing a lot of them around here, although my clients do tell me, I'm not a member of a local club, but my clients do tell me that they are starting to show up more and more. They're in a lot of the CrossFit boxes around here, which is good to see and good to know. But you're probably not seeing many of them out there, are you?
No, we haven't seen any in my area. I'm sure it's a matter of time.
Hey, your folks actually go outside into the wilderness.
That's what we do. We are the people that are spinning the earth. So when we run in Summit County, we're the ones that we all make sure we run, like we have certain directions you have to run on trails and stuff. So we make sure everybody runs in the same direction so that we're all pushing the earth equally in the correct direction. So,
hey, since we talked about the non-powered treadmills, did you want to talk about, the what you had put up today on the motorized treadmills, and how there's the the stretch response and the inhibitory reciprocal inhibition issue on the opposite muscle group? Because I think that would be a good thing for folks to hear.
Well, the treadmill, as you pointed out, is going to pull the hip into extension pretty much immediately as soon as it goes on the ground. And that does two things. One, it puts fast stretch into the hip flexor musculature, which is going to inhibit the glute. And two, it puts fast stretch into the gastrocsoleus or the triceps surae group, which is going to reciprocally inhibit the anterior compartment musculature of the lower leg. So I've searched, I obviously haven't searched hard enough, but to look at EMG activation patterns of people working out on a treadmill versus working out in other areas. But that's one of the things there. So we're getting the stretch there, slow stretch in some cases, or fast stretch if you step on it, it's going a little too fast. But that's going to inhibit the posterior hip and the anterior lower leg. As you pointed out, the knee's brought into extension, so that puts a stretch into the hamstrings, which reciprocally inhibits the quad. And you have to force your thigh. You have to force your thigh forward much quicker because it's being drawn backwards. So that's usually going to cause perpetuation of that whole hip flexor dominant kind of gait, which you'll see with people a lot of times, particularly if they treadmill run all of the time. So we're not saying that treadmills are the scourge of humanity, but you have to exercise caution when using them and telling your clients to use them. I mean, sometimes we've got a treadmill at the office and all that stuff, and when we just can't be outside for whatever reason because it's 30 below zero or something like that, and you just don't want to run, it can be a good workout. But be careful when you're using some of that for your gait analysis, whether it's powered or non-powered, which is why most of the time, not all the time, on our blog, you'll see folks walking just on the ground, and we're videoing them walking away and walking toward us, because then they're just pushing the planet underneath them. They don't have the planet pushing their leg backwards, creating issues, that kind of stuff. So anyway, that was it. And that was a rewind. We had talked about this many times before on both the podcasts as well as on the blog. So.
Well, not to be the Grim Reaper dark cloud on this topic that we just love to beat to death, but keep in mind that when you see studies that require or have utilized gait analysis, video gait analysis with real-time sensors and whatnot, or if you are one of those people working in a gait lab, the things Ivo just talked about, the inhibition of the opposite stretch group, you have to understand that the data that you're picking up is tainted. It's tainted because the treadmill is creating some of these effects. And if you didn't have a light bulb moment when he said, a stretch response into the gastroc soleus group, which creates inhibition of the anterior compartment of the lower leg, if you immediately didn't translate your thought process to, oh my God, they're talking about impaired ankle rocker, that may be why my client is pronating so much, and maybe that's what's causing the internal tibial spin and what's driving that knee into valgus inwards. Maybe that's why what I'm seeing on the treadmill, and maybe my forcing the correction on my client on the treadmill is one thing, but when they're moving through space, as Ivo said, moving on the earth, they don't need that much correction because the ankle rocker isn't as blocked out or neurologically challenged because they're not on a treadmill. So you got to remember, a treadmill is a tool. And it's just like anything else. If you don't know what that tool is used for, and you don't know what it's telling you, and you don't know its limitations, that tool can become a weapon. That's a big word.
So speaking of that, and what you just said flows very nicely when you're talking about EMG and stuff, and impaired ankle rocker and altering function on a treadmill. There was an article that we put up a while ago, and it was just sort of like, hey, this is a good read, full text is available. It was out of the Journal of the Royal Society Interface, and the title of the article, this is one, and we'll put it in the show notes for you. You really should read through, not only because the article is fairly decent, but two, it's just chock full of awesome references to stuff. But it's called "Shoes Alter the Spring-Like Function of the Human Foot During Running." And basically what they found is we've been preaching with the barefoot movement and all this other stuff, not necessarily us preaching, but it's been preached that shoes are cutting down on proprioception and inhibiting the intrinsic musculature of the foot. And this study really flies in the face of that, because what they did is they looked at muscle activation. Now, they only looked at two muscles. They looked at the abductor hallucis and the flexor hallucis brevis, intrinsic muscles of the foot. Now, we remember about intrinsic muscles of the foot that they're basically fire from mid-stance on. They're mid-stance on musculature. Okay, and they fire from mid-stance to terminal stance pre-swing, and then they basically turn off. So that's the only time you get a blast, and the idea is they basically support the supinatory function of the foot and help to create a rigid lever. Well, what they actually found in this study is that shoes increase firing of the intrinsic musculature of the foot. Wow, imagine if we had this when it all started with the whole barefoot movement way back when. So we're not saying that shoes are great. All we're saying is that it's not doing what we said or what we thought that it was doing, cutting down on proprioception. What they actually think is the increased mechanoreception from the foot is as a result of the foot not being able to absorb, so it needs to get more information from the shoe that's surrounding it. So it's pretty cool. They saw an increase in longitudinal arch stiffness in response to this input, and increased activation of at least those two intrinsic muscles. And I found one additional study as well that found the same thing, as well as they looked at quadratus plantae. So really interesting stuff. And what I wanted to point out in the study, and I'm not sure what page it's on, but if you scroll down through, there's a couple really interesting graphs, figure 3 and figure 4 in the study, looking at EMG activation patterns of the different muscles. So they've basically looked at the FDB, the abductor hallucis, the gastroc, and the soleus groups. And they looked at them running on a treadmill, okay? And what we need to remember here is that basically intrinsic foot muscle should be the same running as it is walking. However, gastroc soleus group changes with running versus walking. So with walking, it's present predominantly at the initial portion of push-off, so during the latter portion of the stance phase, whereas in running it's more active throughout. First to as the foot's landing down on the ground, particularly if people are toe strikers. And this EMGs in this particular paper go through and show that. The one thing that it did show, interestingly enough, is that people that were running have much earlier activation of that posterior compartment prior to foot descent. In other words, right before that foot hitting the ground. So they were kind of pre-contracting that posterior compartment, the triceps surae, the gastroc soleus, before they were coming down. And when you look at activation levels as far as EMG, be really careful when you're looking at the graphs. So like the flexor digitorum brevis graph and the abductor hallucis graphs, on the left-hand side, the ordinate, you'll see that the EMG goes, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80. But when you're looking at the gastroc soleus, you have to look, it says 15, 30, 45, 60. So you're getting a differential amount of activation, which you're looking at. So when you look at the graphs, like, oh, they look like they're equal. But when you actually look at what the peak values are, they're quite different from one versus the other. Anyway, the study's interesting. It is chock full of references that are just absolutely awesome that I'm looking forward to going down. And we can thank Q, one of our regular contributors, listeners, to bringing this to my attention. She sent me the full text on this a while ago, and we posted it on our social media page almost immediately. But it's worth checking out, and we'll put the link to full text in the notes as well. I'm sure you have some comments here, Sean. I'm sorry to steal the stage. I'm going to let you go ahead.
No, it was interesting to me too, and I'm glad that this was brought to us, because it made my brain start to think about things that I hadn't really considered before. And we tend to put so much on the importance of shoes and shoe fit, and rightly so. But I think we tend to forget that if you were barefoot running on the earth, the interface is between your foot and the earth. Well, if you put a shoe on your foot, the interface is between still your foot and the earth, but there's just another subtle interface in between there, one that's consistent, that may be controlling of the foot a little bit, but there's still an interface between the foot and the earth. There's just a intermediary in there. And so to think that the shoe wouldn't create an effect or a response that was this big was probably negligent on our part. This study said, and I'm just going to summarize a couple of things. I'm just going to read it here. In contrast to previous assertions, we observed an increase in both the peak flexor digitorum brevis and total stance muscle activation of the flexor digitorum brevis and abductor hallucis or hallucis of the intrinsic foot muscles when running with shoes. In conclusion, an in-series spring-like arrangement of the foot and the shoe dictates that the reduction in system stiffness that occurs when wearing a running shoe will need to be offset by an increase in the stiffness of the longitudinal arch of the foot in order to maintain constant shoe foot system stiffness. That's a mouthful, but go back and look at the study and you're going to realize that the things that Ivo has mentioned here are really worth your time. And this article really, if it doesn't raise some eyebrows and turn on some light bulbs for you, you might not have read it with enough coffee or nicotine gum. So go ahead and go back and have a look at that again, because there is an importance here in upright bipedal locomotion. And I think that negating the mechanosensory stimuli response and stiffness into the longitudinal arch, as were the observations in this study, is kind of an oversight. So you probably haven't heard The Last of Us on this, because there's a bunch of ideas that are kind of percolating here, and I'm sure Ivo has some too. And so, it brings certainly to light our National Shoe Fit program. And if you really want to understand shoes and how they change and affect and modulate the foot response on the planet, you really need to consider taking our course. It is not an easy course. Soft plug here. It's going to require some time to study this. It's going to take several hours of a weekend to get through the material and really master it. And we've set up a 100-question test if you want to get credentialed on it. It's not an easy test either. Ivo and I wrote a very difficult exam. So certainly worth your time if you're in the shoe industry or working in a shoe store and you kind of want to take your game to another level. Contact us, send us an email at thegateguys@gmail.com or message us on our social media, and we'll certainly at least put a dialogue out there for you. So what else do you got to say?
Oh, just, two other quick things, because people are always like, oh, EMG studies, of the foot. This study, they did intramuscular electrodes, which means they stuck needles in the muscle and had people run on them. You got to wonder what kind of an effect that might have had.
tickle, yeah.
On exactly what was going on, and maybe there's some newer technology there. The other thing that they talked about just is the muscle activation patterns, and I won't get into it, for the intrinsic musculature of the foot was significantly different in shod conditions or shoe conditions versus non-shoe conditions, and the conditions, you remember, are going to be somewhat different because we're talking about running, not walking, just as far as where you get the blast. When you look at walking, you see generally a fairly high, you don't see this ramp angle or this typical sinusoidal type curve where activity ramps to a certain point and then diminishes. You basically see a large blast of activity that's relatively constant throughout stance phase. So a little bit different, and it was a great study.
It was really great. I'm glad you found it.
Yeah, well, I didn't find it. Q found it and sent it to me, as she does with a lot of things. And she says, hey, have you seen this? And I was like, no, but this is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Anyway, if you're geeky, there's physics in it too as well, if you're geeky. So there's some physics formulas as well. But the diagrams and the EMG stuff is really good. And it's a pretty new article. It just came out and was published 2016, like May. So fairly good. And like I said, lots and lots of awesome references in it that I'll be going back and reading through. So you put this other study here, and there's two. One's off barbell physio, but the other one is lower limb alignment characteristics not associated with running injuries in runners. Did you want to talk about that a little bit? And then I had a couple comments on that.
Oh, that's the one we talked about earlier. That was one that was the Dr. Bill one that we kind of did discuss that. So you may just have some more comments on that one. So if you want to talk about the lower limb one, go ahead.
Well, we discussed it kind of a cursory manner, but what I wanted to point out was that these people, okay, so they had 89 recreational runners, and these people had been running for at least 6 months and were supposedly injury-free at baseline. And they took a bunch of anthropometric measurements off of them, and then they had them run for a period of 12 weeks, and then they did an analysis, basically logistic regression, to look at the association between lower limb length, discrepancy, all of these things, and the incidence and proportion of injuries. And what they found is, so prior to the study, at the beginning of the study, the running-related injury rate was at 55%. And at 12 weeks, it was at 27%. So what does that mean? In addition to, well, there doesn't seem to be a relation, people got better because they ran for 12 weeks consistently. So the injuries actually became less, even though there were injuries. So running in and of itself may have been helpful for people that may have performed some of these things. So maybe it was the running that helped them to compensate better, because they were doing it on a consistent basis, for things like an increased Q angle or a subtangular angle or a diminished or increased plantar arch index. That was just an important point I thought that we should mention. But because when you're looking at a study, you read the last lines a lot of times of the abstract or the conclusion, but you got to go through and read between the lines. So these people actually improved. They had less injury at the end of the study than they did at the beginning of the study.
Well, and this is something that I have this is usually a light bulb moment for my clients, and I tell them, look, you're starting to train for your half marathon, your marathon. We're 5 weeks in, and you're starting to get this ache here and this pain here. And I said, look, if I had you go down on the floor right now and do 200 push-ups, I bet you I could call you in the next day or two and say, hey, how are those pecs feeling? A little sore, a little inflamed. Push on the tendon. Ooh, it's a little sore, isn't it? If I had you do 200 push-ups the next several days, you'd start to get a little pissed off at me. And so this is that whole durability thing, and I have this conversation with my clients a lot of the time. Yes, I'm glad you're in my office. I'm glad we're looking at this so we can correct your biomechanics. But it may just be that you have never run before, or you've just gotten off a 2-month sabbatical of your running because you were healing up a hip problem or whatever, and now you're starting to get some shin splints or Achilles tendinopathy or tib posterior tendinitis because the muscles just doesn't have enough endurance or durability to sustain the miles that you're at. So hey, let's take off a couple days here. Let's go back at a lower mileage, no speed work, because that's just an acceleration of the loading response. Let's just do some low baseline miles, or maybe let's run for 5 minutes and walk for 1, run for 5, walk for 1, or some variable or variation of that, and allow yourself to build up some endurance and durability, and allow the tendons to endure some reasonable loading responses so that we can get some tolerance to the loading response. So that is my explanation of what you just said, is that the running actually becomes part of the therapy to strengthen the running muscles. But unfortunately, we are humans and we are knuckleheads, and we have a goal and we have a certain number of weeks, which we have not given ourselves enough to factor in down weeks and injuries and periods of cross training. I've got 8 weeks and I have to do this many miles this week and at this week, so I can't afford to have this injury. I better call the doctor. Well, it's never a bad thing to do that, but sometimes you've set up a scenario that's just impossible for your body to develop some training effect and tolerance and durability to the loading responses that you're imparting on it. That doesn't mean every single injury you get, the answer is, I'm going to take a couple weeks off and go back at it and not go in and see a doctor. If the problem comes back and it's persistent or it's getting worse, it's time to pick up the phone. But, there's never anything wrong with using your head on these things, but, we're human. We don't do that. We've got a million things to do, and we've got a bucket list, and that bucket list isn't going to get full with this injury persisting for more than 3 weeks and still running on it. So that comes down to the human nature thing. Maybe I just need to give this thing a bit of a rest and a break and go back in at a lighter load. And I think that's a lot of the times why people get injured when they start doing speed work. I use the example of the old guy that comes into my office the day after the first leaves fall, and he's raking, and he's got back pain because he was raking leaves. And, the old guys will say, hey, doc, my rake weighs maybe 2 pounds and leaves don't weigh anything. You're telling me that this is from raking the leaves? And, my response is, how often do you rake the leaves? It's the old joke of having a professional strawberry picker. They don't come into your office with back pain because they do it all year round. And so if this is your first run of the year, or this is your first half marathon or marathon, don't be surprised that you're using some muscles that you haven't. I'm reminded of when I went into jiu-jitsu, the first month it felt like just a chronic groin pull all the time because of the guard position in jiu-jitsu. And you're just constantly squeezing your inner thigh when you're in the guard position, which means you're on the ground and you got your opponent between your thighs. And, it's just a defensive technique. And I realized, I need to take a couple days off here because we're not going to get this healed. So even I have my patient knucklehead moments. So
no way. I don't believe it.
No way. Hey, I wanted to throw one more thing out, and then I know you could probably have to go, and we're already an hour into this. But back in my residency, one of the things that we did with our ACL patients, just to go full circle on this whole podcast today, one of the final determinants of whether the rehab had been completed was single leg jumps, right leg and left leg. So if the right leg was the ACL reconstructed leg, you would have them do a single leg hop as far as they could, and you'd measure that out, and you have them do it 3 times and take the average distance. When the patient could get within a small standard deviation of difference on a single leg hop on the ACL reconstructed leg that was close enough to the other within that deviation, then they were rehabbed. And a lot of patients can't do that. Right now I am actually rehabbing a ex-professional NBA player who had just had a patellar tendon reconstruction. He's been through rehab. He's not making any headway, and everything looks good. So I had him skip down the hallway, and every time he tried to do a skip on that affected leg, he couldn't do it. So I had him do 3 single leg hops on his good leg, and I had him do 3 single leg hops on his 8 or 10 week post-surgical knee, and he couldn't do more than 2 hops before he broke down and felt the knee become unstable. And that goes back to that whole proprioceptive and loading response and isometrics, eccentrics, concentrics. But it also brought up the issue that through the examination, I showed him that he had atrophied and weakened his calf and Achilles mechanism, his plantar flexor mechanism. And so he didn't trust the knee in full plantar flexion, which goes right back into the final article, which we're not going to get to today, I don't think, unless you have time, but we can certainly put that one into our next podcast. That one was entitled Impaired Foot Plantar Flexor Muscle Performance in Individuals with Heel Pain. But I'm kind of ending on a jumbled thought there, but
that's okay.
Yeah. So, bottom line with that thought is use single leg jump distance to really see how coordinated and stable your client is. If they have reduced proprioception and sense of stability, the hop distance is going to be less, and their brain isn't going to want them to go out into a full hop there without a buckle response afterwards, because you're supposed to hop and then hold the end hop. Stick the landing, so to speak. And it's really a great predictor when you're looking at ankles and knees, and certainly reconstructed post-operative knees and ankles. So keep that in mind, folks. Single leg hop, people don't think about that a lot of the time. They tend to do a lot of single leg proprioceptive work on Bosu balls and whatnot and balance boards, but the hop is a big one, especially in a basketball player. So plenty of sports do it though. Basketball, soccer, volleyball, you name it. So don't forget the hop.
Got it.
Well, good podcast. Good podcast.
Yes.
Yeah, beat that one to death. Yeah. All right. Not sure who our sponsors are. We'll do that when I'll add that on to the end here. But we've been having lots of great sponsors over these last few shows. New Balance, Ultra, Rock Tape, Soft Science, Topo Shoes. If you or your company wants exposure to thousands upon thousands upon thousands, we are over 12,000 now international followers. If you would like some significant exposure to your product, give us an email. Reach out to us, and if we think your product is good for our listenership here, we'll do the due diligence, make sure that we feel it's worthy of our listeners, and we'll see if we can do a deal with you guys. But we'd like to introduce some new products to you guys, so if your company's out there and you're listening to us and you want some exposure, reach out to us. So, Sean Allen here in Chicagoland.
Ivor Warlip, Dillon, Colorado. We will see you in the shoe aisle.